Rex Trueform building is a building that I always passed as a student. It literally caught my attention because it has such a huge presence, you know. This is not actually such a pretty building, but people talk about this as if it's like, you know, a family member. I was really intrigued about how can that social imagination and social history link with architecture. There were always people standing in queues, waiting for trains and taxis at 5 o'clock, waiting to go home, and there was always a buzz. And then there started being less presence of people around the buildings, and it was because of the retrenchments, you know. It was because there were less people going into the building. By 2013, the buildings were completely vacant, you know, there was a scattering of people working there. It's almost like the building died. The more you scratched, the more you looked at the archive, the more you spoke to people, you realized this is not an architectural story, but it's so much bigger than that. So Rex Trueform, the company, they actually occupied two major sites in Salt River, across the road from each other. On the right hand side, on the corner of Queen's Park and Main Road, that was the oldest building dating from 1938. And that building was conceived as a like a big production floor and cloakrooms on the main road with this very curious balcony that pops out onto Main Road. It had a sawtooth roof, and then on the facade it had a series of windows, and these windows were depicted the amount of cloakrooms that there were. And if you look at the plans, all the cloakrooms were essentially designated for non-European women, fewer cloakrooms that were dedicated to European women, and then some cloakrooms that were designated for European men, much fewer, and then non-European men, you know. So the majority of those windows that you saw on the facades and the pictures of the building when it first opened basically indicated that non-European women, you know, were the workforce. Those plans are very interesting to see how, you know, these buildings were conceived to categorize people. We're talking 1938, 1937. There were no laws that said these things must be like this. So architecture actually preempted it. The architects, the owners, they wrote it in, and they started a kind of a apartheid categorization of people through industry. To have such duplication of cloakrooms along race, gender and all of that is extremely expensive. They were the beginnings of laws, they were the beginnings of conversations in Parliament.
Is one which is called by an Afrikaans word apartheid, and I'm afraid that has been misunderstood so often. It could just as easily and perhaps much better be described as a policy of good neighborliness.
If you think about it, in 1948 nationalist government came into power. In 1951 was the Population Registrations Act. There was segregation in Cape Town, you know, there were kind of racial segregation, class segregation, but it wasn't entrenched in the fabric, you know, like modernist architecture then put it in place, so basically put it down in the DNA of our cities, you know. Rex Trueform told you what you're going to be. Are you going to be a non-European woman, or are you going to be a European woman? You're going to be a working class colored woman, you're going to be a native, whatever. The architecture tells you that. That building grew and grew and grew. What happened is that it burned down, and they added to it, and then they erased the cloakroom facades, and they pushed the cloakrooms all the way to the back of the site on Factory Road. The buildings grew every time there was a big moment in South Africa. In 1948, they built the big factory across the road, you know, like that's the new factory opened. It's the same time as the nationalist government was elected, you know. In 1961, there was a huge crisis economically in South Africa, but at the same time, Rex Trueform grew and added a whole new section to the buildings, which we see there today. They bought the building next door which was the Kavala cigarette factory. This Kavala cigarette factory was also designed by the same architect. And at the back there of that building, there was a small section that was dedicated to natives. In the plans, it's all there. Verwoerd makes reference to Rex Trueform and say, I'm so glad that these businesses are coming on board to help us basically recuperate after Sharpeville. And when Mandela went to jail in '64, they actually grew and they became more powerful. And the '60s was the high point, you know, economically for Rex Trueform, and they added, the whole complex grew, and they actually had a factory in Scotland as well. By the '70s, you know, sanctions, strikes, things started, you know, changing a little bit. And you can see that in the architecture as well in some ways. And then definitely by the 90s, in 1991 when Mandela was released, they opened Queen's Park retail. Queen's Park is basically imports, you know, so imports from China or from Asia, and what their role was to tweak the garments, not really making anymore. Rex Trueform was also part of that process. They wanted a heritage assessment of the buildings to understand its significance. Now, significance is a big word in the heritage world. Significance is about why is this building important, you know, and that is the motivation is around significance. These buildings are important because they were examples of an extremely interesting modernist style. Technically, they were part of an international style that arrived here in Cape Town through Max Polikansky, who studied in Liverpool, and you know, it was his first building. He was 26 years old when he designed these buildings. He came from a very prominent Jewish family, went to Liverpool. Before that, there weren't really modernist buildings like that. You know, they were doing UCT, which is a kind of a neoclassical style, Grote Skuur, and then Rex Trueform was the kind of, you know, poster child for a kind of an international modernist style. Putting up a nice building and beauty and architecture is kind of subjective, you know, like the building is beautiful to me, it might not be beautiful to you, it might not be interesting to you or interesting to even the ex-workers, but you can't deny the social significance. That is kind of like a, you know, it's there and it's there to be dealt with. So I put a lot of emphasis on that, and I think the grading committee passed it because of that in a way, you know, and yeah, that's basically, and also in the book that I wrote was a lot around that, but also the story needs to be told in multiple ways, you know. It can't just be told from the social significance, because you can have a really ugly duckling building that hasn't a lot of aesthetic qualities, but the social significance is so high, it affects the grading. But here we had a technical achievement and a social significance, and it was quite easy, I think, for them to recognize it as a grade 2 heritage site.